Welcome to the podcast Hot Tracks with Cold Liquids, where we discuss the history, lyrics, and music of our favorite albums while drinking the best beverages. Each episode, one of us submits an album which we add to an ongoing ranking. At the end of the year, we will tally up each of our total scores to determine unequivocally which one of us has the best taste in music.
What are we drinking today?
I'm drinking Cider Boys Grand Mimosa Apple Orange Hard Cider brewed in Wisconsin. I wanted to pick something kind of like summery, because Beach Boys.
It makes sense because Cider Boys and Beach Boys.
You're right.
Boys.
I definitely planned it like that.
I'm drinking the same thing I drank last week. Freedom Lemonade by Revolution Brewing.
I thought you didn't like it.
Yeah, you said it was bad.
Well, I bought a 6-pack.
Fair.
Well, it's not horrible. I've actually had it again, but I can't imagine myself buying it again. I also think it's a limited time. Lemonade and like sours are pretty good in the summer, but not really something I want to drink out of season,
I managed to finally find the powdered iced tea in the only Walmart within an hour radius of where I am. So I am drinking raspberry powdered iced tea instead of that bad, horrible tea that I was drinking last week. And this stuff's really good.
So what's the album for this week, Max? It's your turn to pick.
Yeah,
we already it's the title of this episode, but explain.
This week, my selection was Brian Wilson Presents Smile by Brian Wilson. Controversial and contentious album. Originally supposed to be released by the Beach Boys in 1967 as a follow-up to their album that was very successful in the United Kingdom, but not as much so in the United States, Pet Sounds. And the project was ultimately scrapped by Brian Wilson, the lead singer of the Beach Boys. It was put on the shelf for decades until finally in 2004, Brian Wilson decided it was time for the world to hear Smile in its complete form, albeit a little bit different from the original form. No one knows exactly what the album would have looked like had it been released at the time when it was supposed to. And so he recorded with a new band, and that's the album that we are looking at today. And then in 2011, the Beach Boys also released an album called The Smile Sessions, which was a collection of tapes and recordings from the original Smile Sessions of when they were recording it back in 1967. We'll definitely talk about that today as well, and maybe some of the differences if you guys listen to that along with the 2004 Brian Wilson version.
So I totally spilled my beverage all over my keyboard, and I had to clean it up. I guess it's hazards of doing a podcast where you drink beverages. I don't know.
I don't have that problem, so
yeah.
Maybe I'm just stupid.
I know how to drink without spilling.
So when did you guys first listen to this album? A long history with it, or?
So in its entirety, I listened to it for the first time maybe 5 months ago, and it became one of my favorite albums of all time. I've really recently been getting more into Brian Wilson and his life story. I watched the movie Love and Mercy, which is a biopic about his life, which is a very well done movie, as well as a few BBC documentaries about the Beach Boys and Brian Wilson himself. Those have kind of just shown me like how amazing of a person he is. And so really like a couple of months ago, I really just wanted to like try to understand his music better, because I've loved Pet Sounds for years now, and I had never like made the leap of like listening to Smile, and I didn't really know why until a couple of months ago, and I was just like, why haven't I listened to this yet? I don't know.
Mhm.
And then I listened to it and really, really, really fell in love with it, and to the point where I would say it contends with Pet Sounds at least. But Brian Wilson made Pet Sounds for the Beach Boys, but he wrote Smile for himself. And you definitely can hear that when you listen to it. And if you know his life story, um, just uh, it's a really incredible album, I think.
Yeah, it's definitely an interesting album, especially in, I guess, the grand scheme of music history. Definitely like contemporary music history, because Smile was probably like a notoriously like canceled album, and
Yeah,
there's like this mythology around it. I became like aware of Smile's existence whenever I was like pretty early in like my music listening journey. I would say like Pet Sounds is like, whenever I think about it, the first album I really got into. Uh, I saw it on like the Rolling Stones top like 1 million best albums ever, and I knew like the Beach Boys. I listened to the Beach Boys Christmas album growing up, so it was a album I really liked, and that along with like The Stranger by Billy Joel or like Sergeant Pepper's uh,
Mhm.
are all albums I really remember listening to whenever I started developing my own taste in music. And like learning about this canceled lost follow-up to Pet Sounds was like really intriguing. It's like being an archaeologist and finding like the Temple of Doom. Uh, so I became really infatuated with Smile Sessions, and it's like this really interesting kind of view of like how an album is created, especially one that has like as much of a torrid kind of development cycle like Smile
yeah,
had. And listening to like Brian Wilson's like recollection of what it might sound like in 2004 when he's much older. Like this is a much older Brian Wilson than 1967.
yeah,
Uh, and it tells in it. And also like some of the lyrics are different than what got eventually sliced and diced into like 3 to 4 mediocre albums.
It is interesting hearing some of the tracks that I'd heard on other Beach Boys albums that are like all supposed to be in one album together. Uh, and it really made it much more enjoyable to hear them like in one unit like they were supposed to be. It makes a lot more sense. Like I think the best example is like Vegetables, where I'm listening to Smiley Smile, uh, and like why is there a song about vegetables on this album? Uh, but it makes a lot more sense when you put it as like definitely a theme of like being active
yeah.
in other songs in the album. So it makes a lot more sense.
Well, just I guess to give our listeners some background, if you don't know the story of Brian Wilson, I'll give a brief synopsis here. But like, I definitely recommend learning more about it because it's just a fascinating story. Um, and but basically, a lot of people know the Beach Boys as like this poppy surf rock group from the early '60s with hits like "Fun, Fun, Fun" and "Little Deuce Coupe" and other songs like that. And then you have like more developed Beach Boys listener that are like, oh, no, Pet Sounds. You have to listen to Pet Sounds because Brian Wilson's a genius. He did all these genius things. He's a composer. He's one of the best composers of the last century. And then you get to like a whole nother level of like understanding, oh my gosh, there's so much more to Brian Wilson and there's so much more to the Beach Boys because the story does not end in 1966 with Pet Sounds. And that's like Austin was talking about, kind of the mystery of this Smile project is a big part of that, where the Beach Boys created Pet Sounds, and then the Beatles produced Revolver. And Brian Wilson really felt the urgency to release something. Brian Wilson, in many ways, felt like he was representing America in the United States in this war, so-called, war against British invasion, and felt the need to produce an album as good as Revolver, and what would eventually be come Sergeant Pepper's after Revolver kind of turned into the enemy of some sorts, but not really the enemy. And so it felt just an enormous amount of pressure to create an even more perfect album than Pet Sounds, which I think a lot of Beach Boys fans might say that's not possible. And at the same time, Brian Wilson was starting to experiment with many different types of drugs, including hash and LSD. And the use of those drugs combined with his mental health issues, he suffers from a schizoaffective disorder, I believe is what it's been coined as now, which is different from schizophrenia. But he has auditory hallucinations, and that were definitely amplified and triggered by his drug use. And that, combined with the pressure of like trying to create the perfect album, I think is generally what's considered why he scrapped this project, as well as just like his own discontent, and then issues with internally with the Beach Boys and him and Mike Love over some of the lyrics that were written by Van Dyke Parks, who was hired by Brian Wilson himself. It's really hard to cover it all in a podcast, but that's just the brief synopsis of what led to kind of like this like deterioration of this album and the Beach Boys in general. And then Brian Wilson suffered health problems for many years, mental health problems. It still does suffer from them. Was treated by Dr. Eugene Landy, who abused him, basically used him to make a lot of money and make a record that almost all of the proceeds of that record went to Brian Wilson's doctor from his patient. Just an awful thing that happened to him throughout the 70s and 80s until finally he got out of that situation. And so to me, like this 2004 version of Smile, and why I personally enjoy it more than the Smile sessions, is because, like Austin said earlier, you have this like older Brian Wilson. His voice is not as good as when it was when he was younger because of the drug use and just getting older. And like at the same time though, like you have a completely different man that persisted through all of that abuse and like all of those trials and tribulations and just a really, really, really difficult life, and is able to persist through that and finally release the album that like has this whole like mysticism behind. I think is just amazing. And like, I don't know, some of the songs like Surf's Up, it's like the message within them is like almost amplified, and you can kind of hear like parts of his own story that are written into this. And it's, I don't know, it's just very, I for that reason I like the 2004 version.
I thought the sound quality was better for one thing. The way it was all lined up and stuff, it felt like more of a cohesive thing. I mean, it was interesting listening to the Smile sessions as well.
Yeah.
I like that the Beach Boys are in the Smile sessions because it feels really weird to listen to a Beach Boys kind of album without the whole group. I think a lot of their appeal is that they're all living out in Los Angeles and they're all together and having fun. And that's definitely, fabricated for marketing and stuff to a degree, but it's still really cool to have all the like Beach Boys together singing this and having all the different voices.
Yeah, I I agree. I think that part of why I like Pet Sounds and a lot of their earlier work is because of the harmonies. I think that if there's one thing that is really good about early Beach Boys, it is like how all, I think there's five members, three Wilsons, and then two other brothers, two cousins. I don't remember. They're a family band. All of them harmonizing on songs like Good Vibrations or God, Surfing USA.
Yeah, sure. Surfing Safari, all that stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. Like they sound good together. And I don't know if the Beatles they don't normally sing a lot together on their songs, and they don't necessarily are as complex vocally.
Yeah.
It's definitely a trademark of the Beach Boys, but like I said, like I think Brian Wilson and Van Dyke Parks, I think wrote this album it's a testament to America, the Americana,
Mm-hmm.
for sure, and you definitely get that pushes through, especially the first like third of it. But then also, I think a testament to Brian Wilson and Brian Wilson's genius. Pet Sounds, you have, for example, like God Only Knows. Like Brian has stated that he wrote that song for Carl Wilson, and that's why he had him sing it. Is because he was a very spiritual person, and he wrote that song like for Carl.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the songs on here he wrote for like specifically for a concept, and Van Dyke Parks wrote the lyrics for a concept, albeit an abstract concept. But the music really is where I get hints of like George Gershwin, especially, and
Mm-hmm.
some of the other people that like have really influenced Brian Wilson that just emulate through this music. You have a bunch of different like American genres that are uniquely American, like doo-wop and Western and like a bunch of these different genres, and then mix it together with like Brian Wilson's genius. And it just feels like an album created by him for him.
Yeah.
And I just really enjoy I enjoy the 2004 version of just him singing his album.
Mm-hmm.
And part of that I think is because it's the one I listened to first. I listened to it before the Smile Sessions,
Yeah.
but it just for me it sounds a little odd to hear Mike Love singing over and over the Crow Cries Uncover the Cornfield when I know in reality he absolutely despised that lyric and didn't want to sing it.
Uh-huh.
Like, because he was like, oh, that doesn't make sense. It's hard to hear other people singing the work of a genius that I think when they didn't want to necessarily be a part of it. Some of the Beach Boys.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think part of, kind of in that line, the thing that makes me sad about listening to the Smile version that's just Brian Wilson is that it just reminds me of like the internal struggles that were happening in the Beach Boys too. And it kind of depresses me a little bit. To prepare for this album, I attempted to make it through all of the Beach Boys albums. I didn't quite make it, but I made it to like the early 70s. I think Surf's Up was the last one I listened to. And there's just something really, I guess I hadn't appreciated how much of their music is about them just, having this like gang of guys like hanging out in California. And that was definitely a big part of their appeal. I thought it was kind of funny. A lot of times they'll like include like a little bit of a recording session or something of them just like screwing around on the album. And they just have a lot of fun with it. And I guess I missed that a little bit in this one. But that being said, this is probably at least top 3. If you were to include this as a Beach Boys album, it's like in the upper echelon of Beach Boys albums. A lot of them are not very good, especially by today's standards. They have good singles on them, but the LPs are like a vessel for promoting the singles instead of having like a cohesive album, like, and then like Pet Sounds and Smile and stuff, they're supposed to be like almost like a symphony.
I agree. In preparation for this, I watched the documentary as suggested by Max called Beautiful Dreamer, Brian Wilson and the Story of Smile. And it was a pretty good kind of explanation of them talking about like the early life of Brian and all the band members getting together, all of them being very successful. And then it really gets into the weeds whenever the rest of the band is out touring in England after the success of Pet Sounds. And Brian is stuck in Los Angeles, I believe, one of the suburbs, because he's from, I can't remember, Hawthorne, California.
I think his house was in Malibu.
He's in like the general Los Angeles area.
Yeah.
Just like some of the insanity around all of this. And I think like one of the most telling moments about the process is that the rest of the boys came back, and Brian Wilson just showed him like what he had been working on, and Mike Love is like, really, this sucks. Like, the big one was Surf's Up was the point of contention, which I get because it is like the most avant-garde song, especially for like Beach Boys standards. Like even some of the weird ones like Mrs. O'Leary's Cow and Vegetables, like you can put them in as like a fun song to do in concerts. But, like Surf's Up is like almost like unperformable in like the Beach Boys setup. So is all the other two songs. Like Mrs. O'Leary's Cow, there's like a bunch of slide whistles and like choo choos and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
It's like I like it. I think it's kind of fun.
Now I'm just kind of imagining them coming back from tour. They're like, "Hey, what have you been up to?" And he like shows them vegetables.
Yeah,
I think what gets lost in this is like yes, Brian Wilson is writing these songs like by himself, but the Beach Boys are still like very involved in the recording of this album, which you can tell by the Smile sessions. And Mike Love often gets villainized just in Beach Boys lore, which is like kind of fair.
I disagree.
But not entirely fair, but it's like, But the thing is like, you can tell like dealing with Brian is a hassle.
Yeah.
And also just like, he just has a different point of view, which doesn't mean it's necessarily like a wrong, like completely wrong point of view. It's just like, he's like, let's stick to the formula, which is like, it's just a different point of view.
Yeah. They definitely had a lot of success doing that. And then, I mean, Pet Sounds, now looking back, Pet Sounds is like one of the best albums of all time. But if you're in the 60s, it didn't really do all that well commercially, especially in the States, compared to some of their other albums coming out before then too. I can absolutely see that point of view of like, let's just cash those checks and keep writing songs about the beach.
It was received well in England or the UK, and they were touring like pretty consistently.
Mm-hmm.
But also like it was pretty well received critically. Like one part in the documentary is Brian Wilson, who like does a lot of interviews throughout it. He's talking about how like Paul and some of the other members like called him up and is like, it was either about Pet Sounds or Good Vibrations, because Good Vibrations was the leading single from what I remember. Like it was released pretty early on in the development because they were still on like that single cycle.
Yeah. Right.
And like Good Vibrations became like the most popular song the band had released up until that point. And I believe like Surf's Up was also released early. I don't know. A lot happens in the documentary, which I do have problems with the documentary. And a lot of the documentaries in this style, I think that it's very uncritical of Brian, because throughout it, there are moments where I'm like putting myself in the shoes of Mike Love and having to deal with Brian. I can imagine it being very complicated. There's this one part where he talks about building like a tent to just like chill out in. And of course, as Max talked about, he did a lot of smoking. So this tent became like unusable because he wouldn't put vents in it. So that was just like a big thing. And everybody was building this tent for like figuring out how they're going to do it. So they build this tent and then like nobody uses it. And then also another segment is Brian Wilson gets a sandbox because he wants to like feel the sand. And he brings in this giant sandbox and then gets his piano in there.
That's where he wrote Good Vibrations.
And also Heroes and Villains and Surf's Up, he wrote in that sandbox.
Oh my gosh.
He's a lot to deal with. Which, I mean, you got this album, but also like, you don't know how good an album's going to be. Yeah. And like, if you're listening to Surf's Up, Heroes and Villains, Good Vibrations, Mrs. O'Leary's Cow, they don't come together. If I listen to them all together, they do not come together.
What I find very interesting, Brian Wilson, in interviews now, people will ask him like about his drug use, and he is the most he just I love this about him. He's the most brutally honest and open person. Like he will just and direct. He just directly answers a question. Like it is insane. I love seeing him interviewed, and any interviews with him are really fun to watch. Just generally, as a side note, but interviewers will ask him like, "Did those drugs play a role in being able to write songs as good as the songs he wrote?" And he says, "Yes, absolutely." But he says, "If I had to do it all over again, I wouldn't. I wouldn't take the drugs." Famously, he said, "Pet sound. There would be no pet sounds if I didn't smoke or if I didn't do LSD. But
Yeah.
I wouldn't do it over again."
Yeah.
I saw a really interesting poster at a conference one time that was like the creative effects of LSD. I don't remember the details of it, but there have been several artists through the years that have been influenced by that, you know, for better, for worse. Another really crazy thing about this album is the way that it was recorded, uh, especially like the initial sessions for recording this. They were like taking like all these little snippets, and then Brian would like sit there and move them around into all these different segments and stuff. And you know, with technology today, that doesn't seem that crazy. You can just copy paste, click and drag, whatever in GarageBand. But I mean, he was actually going through and physically cutting the tape and moving it around, and then being Brian Wilson and like a tortured artist is like, no, 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 I'm gonna put it in this order instead.
With Brian Wilson, he has like all of it in his head.
Yeah.
Like so when he like cuts a piece of tape, moves it over here, it moves in his head over there, and you see him like you see videos of him in the recording booth, and he's just kind of like almost like moving stuff around with his mind whenever he's recording. Like,
Yeah, it's crazy. I can't believe he was able to like recreate this 40 some years
yeah.
later. That's insane. I mean, like, just trying to like write a song, screwing around. If I don't record myself playing it, like immediately the next day, I won't remember it.
Well, and that's what was amazing about the documentary. One of my favorite parts was that he was just like, "Oh yeah, I called up I called up Van Dyke Parks, and we just wrote it out. We just banged it out." That's how he talks. So he's just like, "Yeah,"
Yeah.
because he also writes all of his songs. Like I know God Only Knows was written in like 30 minutes. Famously, he says.
Oh my gosh,
Um,
really? That's
yeah.
insane.
And like, so that's how he talks. He's always like, "Yeah, no, I don't know. I just did it. I just did it. I just wrote this song. It's a
Yeah.
great song."
One question. We're talking a lot about like how great the story is and like how influential the Beach Boys are. How good is this album? Because I have complicated feelings about that.
Yeah, I know what you mean.
Personally, I think the music on this album is amazing, and it listens like a symphony, even more so than Pet Sounds, because it's separated into movements, and you can tell that that's his goal. And I can't even imagine if this was released when it was, because you think about like you obviously you have the idea of a concept album, right? That's starting to come with Pet Sounds and other bands like Pink Floyd or whatever. But then like also rock operas are getting like really huge too. And this is like almost essentially a rock opera or at least a rock symphony.
Mm-hmm.
And so this would have been like probably like one of the first of its kind in that area. Like, cause I think this would have been before Quadrophenia and like Tommy and some other, you know.
The Who was doing rock operas in like late 60s, I think.
Yeah.
I want to say like
But
68.
It would have been about the same time. I don't know if it's
Yeah.
before or not, but it definitely would have been like huge. What's amazing is that you didn't have anything that was like Americana. I think that's the most conceptual part of this album is the idea of the movement of colonialism and like kind of looking back on America's history with a kind of a different lens that wasn't a very popular opinion during this time. And we can get into the lyrics in a little bit of some of like ideas behind that concept. But what I want to talk about is the music, because I think you hear it best on Heroes and Villains and then on Cabin Essence as well. where the music perfectly encapsulates the ideas that are brought together by Van Dyke Park's completely abstract. Like, you kind of generally know what he's talking about when he writes lyrics. Like, you have like a general idea. You're like, okay, like for Heroes and Villains, for example, like you're like, okay, it's definitely like kind of like a Western, and it's set in like a fictional town. And then you read a sentence and you're like, doesn't quite like, it's not like, yeah, it doesn't quite like make sense in a sentence form, but then you're like, abstractly, you know. And
Yeah.
then Brian Wilson perfectly encapsulates it. The end of Heroes and Villains is where I hear it the most. Where if you listen to everyone, like the listeners can try this, and you guys should both try this. Is listen to the end of Heroes and Villains, and just picture a train, a horse, and fire, like a campfire,
Uh-huh.
while you're listening to it, and you can like hear. Basically, you're like hearing images, I think. And the same thing with Cabanescence. It's like he perfectly encapsulates the lyrics of this whole idea of westward expansion is kind of like what that song is about. And it's kind of got this like home on the range feel, which I think was actually the name of the song originally, on some of the recorded material. But you just kind of get that feeling that's brought forward, and you can the imagery, which is amazing because the lyrics are so abstract, but you
Mhm.
still get this imagery that's brought forth in your mind, and that I think is directly because of the music. And it's fascinating to me. I think Van Dyke Park's lyrics remind me a lot of Paul Simon in terms of there's kind of an abstractness that's you're writing like the feelings of the music, and I can't tell what I can't tell on this album is whether Van Dyke is writing the lyrics to Brian Wilson's music or vice versa. And I think it's a kind of because it's a collaboration and both are true.
Uh-huh.
It reminds me a lot of like Boy in the Bubble by Paul Simon, where or Gumboots or some of those songs on Graceland, where there's an abstractness to them, but the music like encapsulates what you're hearing still.
Yeah, I'm really glad you picked this album. I had never listened to it all the way through before. One time, maybe 2 years ago or something, I had seen it online, and it was like touted, "Oh, this is one of the best albums ever." And I think I only made it through like a couple tracks where before I was like, "Man, I don't really like this." Almost immediately after hearing it this time, I was, "Man, this is so good." I think one of my favorite things is the way just the like tension and release.
Yeah.
Heroes and Villains might be one of the better examples of that, where it's like tense for a lot of the song, and then at the end it just all breathes, and it's really really pretty.
Yeah, I think the album is definitely experimental, both in instrumentation, but also in like the lyrics. It's hard to think of like other things that are quite like this from that era. Of course, somebody's going to find a counterexample, but it really is like pushing the boundaries of like songwriting or even like what instruments belong in pop rock. There's some real wild ones. There's a lot of wild ones on Pet Sounds as well, but this one really brings it up a notch. I don't want to necessarily say that experimentation makes a good album, and I do think some of the tracks are not as great as maybe an album I would say creates like a better overall experience. But the peaks of this are probably like some of the best in the band's history. Like three of the songs on this album, I can definitively say instantly in a top five, not top five, top 10. Heroes and Villains, Good Vibrations, Surf's Up are all like really good. And I think they hold up even as singles, even though like Heroes and Villains was not that well received even by Mike Love. I don't think he liked it that much. Don't quote me on.
Heroes and Villains, I think, out of the three that you just mentioned, doesn't fit as much without the rest of the album,
Mm-hmm.
which is weird because that's what the single off of Smiley Smile.
Yeah.
I do think the ideas behind this album have been like influential. Like it's I could argue there is like a through line between the experimentation that Brian Wilson did and like the experimentation that Animal Collective is doing right now. Like they both have a very similar vibe of like experimenting with instrumentation, like abstract lyrics, really complicated vocal harmonies whenever they do it.
Yeah.
I think like Brian Wilson has been like probably one of the most influential people in music in general.
Yeah.
Like it's hard for me to think of somebody, or at least like pushing the medium forward of like pop rock
Yeah.
or experimental pop. I mean,
And psychedelic.
I could say like Brian
Yeah.
Eno or other like early electronic artists. We're in the forefront of thinking of music in a new way.
I think you could definitely say that at least is true for American musicians.
True.
What's amazing to me is how close this is to just an entire symphony, and like you
Mhm.
just hear portions of Bach mixed with Gershwin, mixed with the
Yeah.
Beach Boys, which is so cool. And my favorite part, just like a symphony, there's like callbacks to like certain themes, like musical themes, where you'll just hear a small portion of Surf's Up. One of my favorites is in Roll Plymouth Rock. It does the heroes and villains like again.
Mhm.
Or in one of the songs, I can't remember which one, you hear part of Good Vibrations earlier on in the album.
Oh, yeah. That was I think it's Songs for
Yeah,
Children,
it's
something?
either that one or Child is the Father of Man. I can't remember which one it is, but
Yeah.
like I think it's so cool to bring up musical themes like that again, and you don't hear that in any like pop album. I've like never heard, barely maybe, I don't know. And I love when they do that in symphonies, like when you bring back an old theme from the beginning of the song, say in like a Tchaikovsky suite or something like
Sure. Oh, you'll like the album I pick next week
that.
then. I'm excited.
Do we want to get into some of the lyrics of this?
Oh yeah.
Oh, sure.
Because
Yeah.
I think like one theme, as we talked about, is Americana, which he did talk about in the documentary. Brian Wilson talked about how his idea for this album was a bike trip from Plymouth Rock all the way to Hawaii. And as you go through the lyrics, I can kind of see it once you really start putting it together. Because I mean, the second song is about Plymouth Rock, and then it ends with in Blue Hawaii, which is about Blue Hawaii or just Hawaii. Um, and then there's also like random songs about like Mrs. O'Leary's cow is a reference to Chicago and the Great Fire.
Oh, how did I not pick up on that?
Yeah, for people who don't know, that Mrs. O'Leary's cow is said to be the cause of the Great Chicago Fire that happened in 1871. Am I right about that
Yeah.
year? Yeah.
This is
It's
where I think I
Yeah.
can't tell. Okay, I can't tell if this is a disconnect, but I'm gonna call it a disconnect. I think there was a disconnect between Van Dyke Parks and Brian Wilson here slightly, because I think Brian Wilson set out to make an album that was very Americana and covered like these themes of like, and what you just said of like going from Plymouth Rock to Hawaii. And then I think Van Dyke Parks, it was very intrigued by the ideas of like colonialism being very bad, and some of those themes that, and not that Brian Wilson was opposed to them in any way. And I'm sure they like collaborated on this at least a little bit, I would think, because I know for sure that Brian Wilson wrote some of these lyrics along with Van Dyke Parks. But I still think you get this kind of like eeriness. You hear it especially on Old Master Painter / You Are My Sunshine and Roll Plymouth Rock and some of the other songs, where the music is very like American and talking about America, but the lyrics are very critical of colonial America and the history of America. It creates this really eerie feeling. For example, on You Are My Sunshine, like that's like an old American folk tune. But the way it's written, it's like this really like creepy, like you were my sunshine, my only sunshine. You made me happy when skies were gray. You never know me how much I loved you. How could you take my sunshine away? Like just that switch in lyrics and then the shift in the tone, it makes you like rethink kind of what the idea behind this album is. Is like, okay, this is almost criticizing like American music, even though I think when Brian Wilson's writing the music, he's like, I'm going to incorporate all these American themes. And I think Van Dyke Parks is kind of using this to like push forward some of his like progressive thoughts of like, let's take a look back and reflect on America. And like I said, I don't think Brian Wilson's opposed to those views at all. But like, I'm not sure if that was entirely realized by Brian Wilson. I think he was just like, "Whoa, these lyrics are far out, like and abstract, and I like that, and that's cool." Because a lot of, in a way, it's critical of the Beach Boys themselves, and you hear that on the lyrics of "Surfs Up." A diamond necklace played the pawn, hand in hand, some drummed along. Oh, to a handsome man in baton. That could easily be about the Beach Boys themselves and their relationship to Murray Wilson, their father, him being the handsome man in baton. Or it could just be a song about classism, which is probably more the case. But I think Van Dyke Parks knew a lot about the relationship with the Beach Boys, and I feel like it's almost like kind of using this album as like a criticism of the idea of the Beach Boys and that kind of idea of the American dream and some of those other things. And I think some of that might have been unbeknownst, not necessarily unbeknownst to Brian Wilson, but like, I don't know.
I thought the album overall was happy. And Brian Wilson talked about how he wanted like a good vibes album, weirdly enough. And I think a lot of it, like Heroes and Villains, Good Vibrations, like a lot of these are just about having good vibes, you know? I don't think there's a lot of albums just about being happy. A lot of really good albums that people love. Pet Sounds is like pretty optimistic, you know?
I don't know, but then like, this is where I get like the music sounds happy in a lot of it, and then you get some lyrics like "Bicycle Rider, look what you've done to the Church of the American Indian" and stuff like that, where it's like like I said, you have this American music. It almost seems like a play on itself because you have this American like mix of doo-wop, Western, and all these American themes, and then you're talking about like colonialism and some stuff that's like, I feel like it's like almost snuck in by Van Dyke Parks. A lot of it does sound happy, and a lot of it has like a childlike innocence to it as well, especially the middle portion of the album. But then it's almost like not overshadowed, but like you have like at the same time, some of these lyrics are definitely not like happy. Like I wouldn't associate the lyrics to most of Heroes and Villains and Roll Plymouth Rock to necessarily be happy.
Yeah, I think it's happier than Pet Sounds. I mean, because on Pet Sounds, he's literally like, sometimes I feel very sad.
Yeah.
But as far as Beach Boys albums go, it's probably more sad than most of them. Brian Wilson loves writing happy songs, and most of their early stuff is just about having fun. Albums from that time, even like I think Friends is just a very like happy album too.
Yeah, so I think it could be really argued like, is the name of the album "Smile" supposed to be ironic or not? And I think in Brian Wilson's opinion, he'd say no. And I think in Van Dyke Park's opinion, he'd say yes.
Yeah, I like that. I think you're onto something there. There are definitely some parts where like the music is just very happy, but like the lyrics are a little daunting.
Like in Vegetables. I
Eating my
noticed
vegetables? That's scary.
I noticed there's this undercurrent theme throughout the album on physical fitness and spirituality. And I think that all of the songs that are positive, or a good portion of them, are about like how great it is just to be active. Which in the documentary, going back again, Brian Wilson talked about how he does not like to be physically active.
Yeah.
How he would make all the other Beach Boys like do exercises and he would just leave. Which was really funny. Brian Wilson is a very charming guy.
He's so funny. Oh my god. It's actually hilarious.
Like, he is very frank about everything, which is it's really charming and endearing. And
Yeah.
like much as I don't like all of the music, like there's some stinkers on this album. But Or
It's really hard not to like it because it's so hard not to like Brian Wilson, and also his story is
yeah,
just amazing. And like
Yeah.
what all of he's overcome. And it's just amazing that he was able to produce this album. It's just cool.
It was so cool. I remember because he like would not play songs off of this album, like Heroes and Villains. No. And then one day in like the early 2000s, somebody requested it. He was just at the piano like with his family, and somebody's like, "Hey, can you play Heroes and Villains?" And they're like, "Oh boy, here we go. He's not going to do it." And then he just
Yeah.
did. And pretty soon after that, he like started recording the album,
Yeah.
I think.
That's like kind of how he just like writes music too. Because I saw an interview with him that was in like the early 2010s, and he hadn't really released much since like I think he did a Christmas album in like 2005 or something like that, and then Smile in 2004. And they were like, "Oh, like you haven't released anything in a while. Are you like taking a break?" And he's like, "No songs come to me." Like he's just like he's just super frank about it, like Austin. So he's just like, "No, I don't have any songs. They're not coming. They're not flowing. When they flow, they'll flow, and then I can write the best album of all time." Is what he's saying.
Yeah,
he's
that is really
an
funny.
interesting guy. I think that because I can't think of another musician besides Bob Dylan that was making, and Johnny Cash, of musicians who were making albums who started in the 60s and made one in the 2000s. And they were like pretty successful. Like Johnny Cash released his album That Hurt Is On right before he died, or soon before. But this was kind of just like a thing he made. Like nobody really pushed him to it. He just kind of decided like one day, which is in the documentary as well, where he was like, I guess I'll just make Smile now.
Yeah, I will say a lot of credit. We haven't talked about the other people on the 2004 version. So the people that he recorded this was just a Beach Boys cover band that Brian Wilson heard one time in like Las Vegas or something like that, and he just went up to them and was like, "Hey, want to record music with me?"
That's so crazy.
Having Brian Wilson come up to you and be like, "That was really good." But the keyboardist, I think his name is, it's like Darian Sana. Um, he was pretty instrumental in like helping Brian piece this together, and used like computers this time, uh, and help him be comfortable in recording this album, because they're definitely in that documentary. They showed like there were definitely days where he was still very uncomfortable, and you could tell he's having auditory hallucinations still. And I think the band that he recorded this with in that documentary, you can see like they just did a very good job accommodating for him, and like just wanted to kind of go at his pace. And I think that's really great as well.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
So, do you think that this album was overhyped? So I remember like with all the lore and stuff with it, it's like this was supposed to be like a symphony to God. This is the best album of all time.
It's overhyped. Like there's no way that it could ever meet the hype of like
Yeah.
the most legendary lost album ever.
And I think that's why Brian Wilson shelved it too.
Fair. I think that it's just a Beach Boy album. Like it's not Pet Sounds 2. I don't think so. I don't think that he could make a Pet Sounds 2, which might be very contentious to say. Like Pet Sounds is just very unique, even within like music as a whole.
Well, it's also very different from Pet Sounds.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of that has to do with Van Dyke Parks writing the lyrics instead of Tony Asher.
Yeah. I think that the album is good. Do I think it's the greatest album of all time? No. Do I think uh, I don't necessarily think it's a spectacular album standalone. Like if I were to listen to this album without knowing the story, I would be like, yeah, this is pretty good. Like there's a lot of really good tracks, but it's not fantastic. Which I mean, that's not wrong. Not all albums can be an 8 out of 10, you know.
I think this album perfectly encapsulates the story of Brian Wilson. and the music of Brian Wilson, because you do have a lot of the musical elements from Pet Sounds that were still brought onto this album and emphasized in this album as well. And I think if you know a lot about music and know a lot about musical components, you'll be very impressed when you hear this album. And the same with Pet Sounds too. But like, it's just fantastic to hear all of the different harmonies that are just bouncing around inside Brian Wilson's head.
When I was listening to this, at times I've felt like, yeah, this is a sequel to Pet Sounds. I think a lot of the instrumentation sounds very similar, like you were saying. It's tough to say. I think Pet Sounds is a lot better, but I enjoyed this album too. But I think, yeah, the overhype was a huge barrier for me early on. Like I said, the first time I heard it, I turned it off because I wanted it to be like the best album ever. That's what I had heard, right? And it wasn't. But then coming back, putting that off to the side and just enjoying it for what it was, it's an excellent album for sure.
Yeah, and I guess it brings up a question of like how much should the story of an album go into, I guess, the grading or like the ranking of it? Because I guess like there is some fair points where I guess like the perfect example is like the College Dropout by Kanye West. It's his first album and it's pretty good, but a lot of it with like the song Through the Wire, I don't think you can really like understand it if you don't know the story where he got into like this horrible car crash and like his jaw was like wired shut and him like persevering through the wire and rapping about it. In the same way, I think that a lot of the songs, I think my enjoyment of the album increased by a good margin after I watched the documentary and heard him like talk about like this is what I was doing whenever I recorded Heroes and Villains and Mrs. O'Leary's Cow. But like, should I factor that in? Do I need to do the required reading? Do I need to watch the documentary for me to think this is a great album? And that's something I still don't know the answer for. Uh, I just wondered your input.
I think it definitely makes it better. Like, and I don't necessarily know why. Except I think, like I said, this encapsulates Brian Wilson, and that makes it just more meaningful. And when something's more meaningful to you, you tend to enjoy it more.
Yeah. And I think like another argument you could make is like we all like the suburbs, but all of us like grew up in the suburbs. Do you have like would you have the same perspective if you did not grow up in the suburbs?
I don't think
And
you
it's
would.
like it's the same idea.
Yeah,
With this, like if you don't understand the perspective that Brian Wilson went through, like I don't think you're gonna get the same output.
I think that's why so many people resonate with Pet Sounds is because it's a story that like, and the themes of it are something that can resonate with everybody because it's
Yes.
about like being sad and being sad about a girl and oh the joy of being in a relationship and like there's all of these themes that like people experience every day as opposed to this is more of like doesn't resonate with you as much for sure as something like Pet Sounds. But that being said, to me musically it's just such a complex album that I think you can't put it into a tiny ball of like, oh, you can only enjoy this album if you've heard the story of Brian Wilson. I think it helps your listening experience, but I think if you know your music, you can really understand that what he's doing on this album is unique, complex, awesome, whatever you want to, genius, whatever words you want to use.
Park champ.
It is a it is a really I feel like I hear this conversation a lot online is like separating the art from the artist. Is it possible and should you do it, and I guess there really isn't an answer to that. I mean, nobody can tell you how to listen to music. You could totally listen to this album and not know anything about the Beach Boys, and you could listen to this album, and if it increases your enjoyment of it, absolutely, do a bunch of deep reading about it. I guess there's really no like prescription of how to enjoy music. You just listen to it and do what you want.
Why don't we get into the best and worst tracks? But I think all of us might agree on the best track on this album.
I don't know. We'll see.
It hasn't happened yet. What's
I was actually so sure that all of us were going to pick one song to be number one that I actually wrote it back up.
Okay, well, let's hear it. I want to know.
I assumed
what you
all
picked.
three of us are going to pick Good Vibrations.
It's not my number one.
I mean, the song Good Vibrations is like amazing. I did not like the version on this album. It sounded wrong.
Because we are factoring in Smile Sessions so much, I'm also factoring in that track.
I think that's reasonable.
Okay.
Because I would say that Good Vibrations is the definitive best song on this album. But not only that, it's the best Beach Boys song. And not only that, I would say it's one of like maybe the best songs ever written. Like there's just something about the intro that's just like grabs me every single time. And it's just like,
yes,
it's one of those songs kind of like Graceland by like Paul Simon, where it just like takes me to a place that's like different from where I am right now. And it's weird that something so poppy and like listenable, like radio heavy, can do that.
And I think that the reason that the lyrics are different, I believe, so Mike Love wrote the lyrics to Good Vibrations, actually. And he wrote them in about 15 minutes.
Oh, wow.
He's the GOAT for that.
And I assume that the reason, I don't know this, but I assume the reason they're different on this album is because there was probably a discrepancy, and this is the lyrics that Brian Wilson and or Van Dyke Parks wanted, but probably Brian Wilson or preferred.
But Mike ones are way better, I think.
I like both.
Oh, so much better.
The one thing I really, really like part of Gotta Keep Those Loving Good Vibrations. I like that part better on this album. Because they do the dum dee dum dee da whoa, and I really like that. I think it adds a lot. It's cool. I forget if that's on the Smile Sessions version. I think it is though, but it's not on like the single version of Good Vibrations.
But I would also say the Smile lyrics is also great, also fantastic.
Yeah,
the Smile lyrics. You said
both versions. I think the Smile Sessions and the updated, both of them are fantastic.
Yeah. I mean, they don't change that much. It's like a few words, and you're just like...
I guess a lot of it was probably just because, like, there was a disconnect in my head where I'm like, this is not Good Vibrations. Like,
I like the added, and I'm picking up before I'm picking up Good Vibrations. I enjoy that, too. I think that's a good element. But I don't like the lyrics of the verses changed as much.
Yeah, I hated the lyrics of the verses. In the original, like in the track from the 60s, I think it's just captures it better. There's something about the lyrics that it's kind of like Summer of Love kind of time, and it feels very 60s. And that's part of what I like about the song. And I didn't get that from the updated ones. But yeah, I think part of it is just like that is a song I've literally like heard since I was like 3 years old, and my brain is like, no, that is not how it sounds, because I could definitely like recreate most of it in my head if I wanted to, and if it doesn't match up with that, it like makes me very bad.
I think Brian Wilson's voice sounds absolutely amazing for being like 60 or 65 or whenever he is on this, and also like with how much drugs he did. I think it sounds amazing for like when you consider that.
So did he record all of the like backup vocals too?
No.
Is it just like overdub? Oh, okay.
No, his voice does not. He can't do ever since like the mid 70s, he can't do his falsetto voice anymore.
Oh, okay. What was your favorite song, Max?
My favorite song? I'm really torn because I really like Roll Plymouth Rock because I really like the Wahalalule Wahalalula chant. It gets stuck in my head every day, I think, for the past like 5 months. And it's probably my favorite part of the album. And then You Are My Sunshine is my favorite version of You Are My Sunshine, and I wish it was longer than like the 45 seconds it is. Because is so eerie and so like cool, and I really love it. But I think I have to go with Surf's Up as my favorite because it's just an amazing piece of music.
That is a good
I
pick.
just amazing, perfect in so many ways. I think the lyrics are really cool. I think it's the perfect blend of Van Dyke Park's lyrics and Brian Wilson's music on this album. There's so many ways it could be interpreted. Gosh, it's just such a good track. So, what's your favorite song?
My favorite song is Vegetables.
You said it was horrible like 2 weeks ago.
I know I did. I have done a complete heel turn.
So you're saying Vegetables is better than Good Vibrations?
And Heroes Were
No, well, when I was preparing this, I was going based off of the songs on the Brian Wilson Presents Smile.
But you really unironically think
so
that Vegetables is a better song on this album than the Good Vibrations on this album, though?
Yeah, I didn't like the Good Vibrations on this album. I wouldn't say that one's my least favorite, but yeah, I don't know. I like that song now. I can't believe it either, because I would have literally 2 weeks ago been like, this is one of the worst Beach Boys songs, but I've completely come around on it, partially because I actually have a vegetable garden. So I don't know. I just think about it when I'm gardening, but I don't know. It's just at first, like I was saying too, though, I knew Vegetables because of Smiley Smile, and it makes no sense to be on Smiley Smile. But in the context of this album, it makes more sense. It's fun. I mean, who else is out there writing a song about eating vegetables, like being healthy? I can't think of anything that's like not for 3-year-olds. You know?
I gotta say, I think Vegetables is pretty low on my list.
Really? I also like it.
Not like the bottom, but like
Vegetables is really better than Good Vibrations, Heroes and Villains, Surf's Up.
That's what I'm saying.
I'm sticking with it. I like all of those, but
I like Barnyard better than Vegetables. I like Our Prayer/G better than Vegetables. I like Wind Chimes. That's a good album or a good song. Cabinescence is probably my second or third favorite song in the album.
Okay.
I didn't even talk about that.
I don't know. I just liked it. Okay, you know, it was.
I just think this is.
I thought it was fun.
It's a hot take.
I thought it was fun.
Yeah.
I had to be bold. I picked it early on, and I stuck with it. But yeah, there are other great songs on there too. I'm not saying that I don't like Surf's Up or Good Vibrations.
Okay, now I want to know what your least favorite song is.
Song for Children. Kind of thought it sounded like a corny musical a little bit, and it was just kind of annoying to me.
I picked Wind Chimes because I thought Wind Chimes is kind of annoying. The way he sings Wind Chimes, I just didn't like it.
Yeah, that's bottom tier for me too, probably.
I really liked Wind Chimes, actually. I don't know if it's probably close to the bottom on just because I like a lot of the other songs in this album more.
Yeah.
I like the bass line on Wind Chimes because you can hear the boom, 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 boom in the beginning of the song, and then by the end of the song, it's blasting, and I kind of like that.
It isn't horrible.
I think Song for Children's probably up there for me, just because this is where it gets weird, because I think in the Smile Sessions, I think Song for Children and Child is the Father of the Man, I think are the same song on Smile Sessions. And I like Child is the Father of the Man, and I don't even think of them as two different songs. There's a lot of this album I don't think of as separate songs. They just bleed right into each other, and it's just okay, we're going. Wonderful Song for Children and Child is the Father of the Man is all one song in my head. And so I'm having a tough time thinking of my least favorite song.
Fair.
And there's also parts of songs On a Holiday is probably kind of meh until it gets to the reprise of the Rock Roll, Plymouth Rock Roll Over, and I like that. But I think I'd probably say Song for Children as well. What song do you think gets stuck in your head the most on this album? Because I've had this album continuously playing on a loop in my head.
Heroes and Villains for me.
Yeah, that one's up there for me. I think I continuously sing Owa Wa Owa Hawaii in my head a lot from Blue Hawaii, and then the Wahalalule Wahalalula.
Yeah. Vegetables. It's been stuck in my head. Also Good Vibrations, but that one's always stuck in my head before this too. It's been driving my wife insane. There was one day, I think Saturday last week, where she could not sleep because it was stuck in her head all night because I've been singing it all the time. And she got like 3 hours of sleep. The things we do for the podcast.
What's your ranking?
4 out of 5. Because the thing about it is, we'll have to do a re-ranking episode.
Yeah.
Because I think that would be an interesting discussion, because now I think I could talk myself into putting Doolittle as number 2. Because the thing about it is, I've listened to Doolittle at least once every one of these cycles. And
Really?
yes, I'm still surprised at how much I do like it, because it's really taking in the slot of like my heavy, angry album in my rotation. And I don't think that Vampire Weekend, which I think is my current number 2, has like the same appeal to me at this point. But we'll talk about that in our re-ranking.
Yeah.
I have not listened to Doolittle since we did the episode. Like, I haven't listened to any of the songs off of it, which isn't even to say that I dislike the album. I'm not actually sure if I've listened to any of the albums since we've done them. I think I just listened to it so much during that time period that I need to take a break after it.
Yeah.
And my style of listening to music is much more of like, just keep it going. I'm always listening to new stuff. I enjoy doing that. At least that's what I've been doing recently. So,
yeah, I think I'm gonna put this at my number 1. It's tough. It's a tough comparison between it and the suburbs, though. So I think re-ranking is gonna be interesting. I think I go back and forth, but I think I might like Pet Sounds better than this album as well. Not that we've done that yet. I just after I think I can just always go back to Pet Sounds, and I feel like after a few months, I think I'll probably like listen to this less often. Like, I've probably been listening to this at least like twice a week for the last like 5 months. So
yeah. Okay, so I'm gonna put this at number 2. Right now I've got Vampire Weekend, Smile, The Suburbs, You Don't Mess Around with Jim, and Doolittle.
Interesting.
what album do you have for us next week, Nick?
All right, next week we'll be doing Close to the Edge by Yes. Classic of the prog rock era.
Hey everybody, thanks for listening. If you liked this episode, be sure to like and subscribe. Follow us on Twitter at HTWCL to see memes and updates on the show. And we'll see you next time. We'll be uploading every 2 weeks on Monday nights.